There's a moment in 1995, and bear in mind, this is 2 full years before South Park was even a television show, where a VHS tape started passing around Hollywood, not through official channels, not through any kind of organized distribution, just person to person, at parties, in offices, someone handing it to someone else and saying, "You have to watch this." The tape contained a short animated film, 5 minutes, give or take. It was called The Spirit of Christmas, and it was made by 2 blokes named Trey Parker and Matt Stone who had practically no money, no studio backing, and a very strong sense of what they found funny. The animation was paper cutouts. The characters were 4 small boys standing in the snow. One of them was named Jesus. And the whole thing was, depending on your sensibility, either the most offensive thing you'd ever seen or the funniest thing in years, sometimes both at once. The tape got to a Comedy Central executive named Brian Graydon. He liked it enough to commission a second short for $1,500. That second short also circulated. A few months later, Parker and Stone had a development deal. And on the 13th of August, 1997, South Park premiered on Comedy Central to just under 1 million viewers, which, for a basic cable channel that had spent most of its existence as a background presence in American television, was a significant number. By the 10th episode, the ratings had jumped to a Nielsen score of 6.4. Comedy Central subscriptions climbed from roughly 9 million to about 50 million households in the space of a single year. The show was everywhere. It was on lunchboxes, it was on t-shirts, it was in conversations that had nothing to do with animation at all. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who had made a 5-minute paper cutout film for no money in 1995, were now running one of the most talked about television programs in the world. And every network executive in America looked at those numbers and had the same thought: we could do that. I find that thought, we could do that, genuinely fascinating because it's both completely understandable and almost comically wrong simultaneously. South Park looked, on the surface, like something anyone could replicate. Simple animation, 4 kids, a small town, crude humor, political incorrectness delivered without apology. The production aesthetic was deliberately rough. The show wasn't hiding what it was. If Family Guy looked like a sophisticated animation product that required a proper studio and a seasoned team, South Park looked like something 2 blokes had made in a garage because they had something to say. And they had. That's the part that got lost every single time someone tried to copy it. What we're going to talk about tonight, and it'll take a while, so get comfortable, find a good position, maybe pull a blanket up if you've got one nearby, is the wave of shows that followed South Park's success. The shows that tried to step into the space the original had cleared. Some of them came from Comedy Central itself, which was in the peculiar position of trying to manufacture a second version of the thing that had already made them. Some of them came from other networks who had watched Comedy Central's subscriber numbers and decided they needed their own version of whatever this was. Some of them came from the internet, in the years before the internet had proper infrastructure to host anything, but were doing it anyway because the barrier to entry was, in theory, 0. A few of them are genuinely interesting stories. Moral Oral started in South Park's shadow and quietly became something Adult Swim had never produced before or since. Happy Tree Friends found a global audience before YouTube existed to give it one. Drawn Together was the 2nd highest rated show on Comedy Central for 3 years and still got canceled in a way so quiet that its creators didn't officially find out for months. Most of them are stories about misunderstanding, about seeing the surface of something and assuming the surface was the whole thing. So that's where we're starting tonight, not with any individual show, but with the thing they were all trying to copy, the formula, or what people thought the formula was. Because if you want to understand why so many of these shows failed, you have to understand what they thought they were doing, and why that turned out to be so different from what South Park was actually doing. It's going to be a long one. We'll move through things gently. There's no rush. If you're settling in, good. Let's start at the beginning. There's one more thing about South Park's early impact that tends to get buried under everything that came after. There's a statistic I find genuinely staggering in the quiet way that numbers about cultural change can be staggering when you really sit with them. When South Park premiered on the 13th of August, 1997, Comedy Central was in approximately 9 million American homes. Within a single year, that number had grown to somewhere around 50 million. The show didn't just find an audience, it built the infrastructure that its audience needed to reach it. Cable subscriptions, in a year where cable was still an optional upgrade and not a default, grew because people wanted to watch 4 foul-mouthed children in a small Colorado town. That's the show's first and most extraordinary achievement, and it tends to get buried under the subsequent decades of controversy and satire and cultural ubiquity. Before South Park was a phenomenon, it created the conditions for itself to become one. Nobody had done that on basic cable before, at least not in that way at that speed. The Simpsons had built a massive audience, but on a broadcast network that reached everybody. South Park built a massive audience by making people pay for access to it. That's a different thing, and it set the conditions for everything that followed. For Comedy Central's expansion, for the emergence of cable as a home for adult animation, for the assumption that adult animated comedy was now a viable programming category with a proven audience. Every show in this video inherited that infrastructure. They were all, to varying degrees, beneficiaries of the world South Park had built by simply existing and being watched by enough people that networks started to think differently about what adult animation could do commercially. They were all made possible, in a structural sense, by the fact that Parker and Stone had already proven the concept, and then most of them failed to live up to it. Which is, when you put it that way, a fairly common story in the history of entertainment. The show that proves a concept isn't always the show that benefits most from the proof. Sometimes the trailblazer just makes the trail, and everyone else walks it more comfortably, and the trailblazer is the only one still moving. Because moving is what they do. South Park kept moving. The imitators, by and large, stood still and waited for the formula to work. The formula needed moving. That's why it didn't work for them. That's also why, on the 28th of October 2025, South Park aired the 5th episode of its 28th season, to an audience that was still there, still watching, still finding something in 4 small figures standing in the snow outside a bus stop in a fictional Colorado town. The bus stop hasn't moved. The show hasn't stopped. Everything else has come and gone around it. The question of what makes South Park sounds like it should have an obvious answer. Crude humor, foul-mouthed children, political incorrectness, small-town Colorado setting, simple animation. These are all things you could list off the top of your head if someone asked, and they would all be correct, in the same way that saying a song has lyrics and a melody is correct. It describes the content without touching the thing that actually makes it work. Here's how I think about the South Park formula after spending far too much time thinking about it. There are really 3 components, and they all have to be present simultaneously. If you get 2 out of 3, you get something that resembles South Park without being it. Most of the shows in this video got 2 out of 3. The first component is the container. South Park uses children, specifically elementary school children, as containers for adult commentary. The reason this works is that it creates a gap between what children are supposed to know and what these children demonstrably know. A gap between the innocence the format implies and the cynicism the content delivers. That gap is where almost all of the comedy lives. When Cartman is being viciously anti-Semitic, part of the reason it's funny and not just horrifying is that he's 9 years old. He's in a child's body, in a child's world, saying things that no child should have the vocabulary or the investment to say. The container creates the irony. Other shows understood this on a surface level and tried to replicate it. Kids saying adult things, adults behaving worse than children. The visual language of innocence wrapped around content that wasn't innocent. The concept was easy enough to grasp. What was harder to grasp was that the container only works if it's consistent. South Park never forgets that these are children. Their concerns are children's concerns. School, parents, friendships, fitting in. And the adult world keeps colliding with those concerns in ways that are both absurd and occasionally genuinely sad. The second component is the target. Every South Park episode, even the weakest ones, is aimed at something. There's always a thing the episode is about, underneath the thing it's ostensibly about. An episode that appears to be about a new restaurant opening in town is actually about cultural appropriation or consumerism or the way Americans process guilt. An episode that appears to be about a superhero game is actually about the diffusion of moral responsibility in mob behavior. Parker and Stone have been consistent about this across the show's entire run. The point isn't the surface joke, the point is what the surface joke is pointing at. This is the component that's hardest to copy because it requires the creators to actually have opinions, not performed opinions, not safe opinions. Real, considered, sometimes uncomfortable positions on things. Parker and Stone have gone after both political parties with equal aggression. They've satirized liberal pieties and conservative ones in the same episode. They've made episodes that made their liberal audience uncomfortable and episodes that made their conservative audience uncomfortable and seemed to be genuinely uninterested in which side enjoyed themselves more. The show's willingness to alienate its own fans in service of a point is what gives the satire its credibility. An imitator who just wanted to be edgy couldn't replicate that because being edgy for its own sake is a completely different project. The third component is the speed. South Park famously operates on a 6-day production cycle. That cycle begins on a Thursday morning when Parker and Stone start writing. By the following Wednesday, a finished episode is transmitted to Comedy Central, sometimes arriving just hours before broadcast. The team working on any given episode, around 70 people, are doing weeks' worth of work in days. It's an extraordinary machine, and it exists specifically to allow the show to respond to things that are actually happening in the world right now. South Park can do an episode about something that happened on Monday and have it on television by the following Wednesday. No other animated show can do that. Most animated shows are working 9 or 10 months ahead. They're planning episodes based on trends and news stories that they expect to still be relevant almost a year later. What this means practically is that South Park can be topical in a way that feels immediate. When it makes a joke about a political scandal or a cultural moment, it's making that joke while the moment is still alive. The joke lands because the audience is still thinking about the thing. An imitator working on a normal animation schedule can't do that. They can be edgy, they can be crude, they can have a small-town setting and foul-mouthed characters and a simple visual aesthetic. But they can't be now in the same way. And being now is a significant part of why the show has felt consistently relevant for nearly 3 decades. So container, target, speed, that's the formula, or at least that's the closest I can get to articulating it. Now let's talk about the shows that tried to copy it. But before we get to the imitators, there's a generation of shows that came before all of this. Shows that South Park was itself responding to, or working alongside, or occasionally reacting against, that are worth pausing on briefly. Because you can't fully understand the wave of South Park imitators without understanding the wave that South Park was part of. The early 1990s were, in retrospect, an extraordinary period for the idea of what adult animation could be. Not because the shows that came from that period were all great, many of them weren't, but because the period was actively expanding the territory. Ren and Stimpy premiered on Nickelodeon in 1991, created by John Kricfalusi, and immediately demonstrated that animation aimed at children could contain content that was genuinely disturbing, visually experimental, and directed at multiple registers of audience simultaneously. The show was watched by kids and by adults who found something else in it entirely. It was chaotic and gross and occasionally beautiful, and it got its creator fired by the studio partway through the run, which is a whole other story. Beavis and Butthead arrived in 1993 on MTV, created by Mike Judge, the same Mike Judge who'd later make The Good Family and King of the Hill. And it was, as Parker and Stone have explicitly acknowledged, one of the primary models for what they were trying to do. The show was technically about 2 dim-witted teenage boys watching music videos, but underneath that surface was something genuinely observed about a specific kind of American underclass youth. About boredom as a condition, about the way that lack of opportunity produces a particular kind of cheerful nihilism, about the comedy that exists in complete absence of self-awareness. Parker and Stone said in interviews around the time of South Park's launch that they appreciated that Beavis and Butthead was actually trying to say something. That it was a great satirical look at where a lot of teenagers in America were at the time. Mike Judge took them out before the show premiered. That level of direct mentorship is unusual in television. And then there was The Simpsons, which had been running since 1989, and which had established the basic grammar of American adult animated comedy so thoroughly that everything that came after, South Park included, was in some sense in conversation with it. The dysfunctional family, the American small town as satirical microcosm, the ensemble cast that allowed the show to pivot between different emotional registers. South Park borrowed these structural elements and then filled them with completely different content, a different production philosophy, and a completely different relationship to speed and contemporaneity. What all three of these shows shared, Ren and Stimpy, Beavis and Butthead, The Simpsons, was a clarity of creative identity. You could describe in fairly precise terms what each of them was trying to do. That clarity was the thing that made them models worth following. The shows that failed to follow them successfully, both in the South Park wave and elsewhere, tended to fail because they had borrowed the aesthetic without the clarity. They knew what they looked like. They didn't know what they were for. South Park knew what it was for. That's the simplest version of the entire argument I'm making tonight. The imitators didn't. And there's one more precursor worth mentioning briefly because it's the one that most directly demonstrates what happens when a show built on an extraordinary creative identity tries to continue past its creative peak. The adult party cartoon version of Ren and Stimpy, made by John Kricfalusi for Spike TV in 2003, after he'd regained the rights and the budget to do whatever he wanted, is one of the most instructive failures in animation history. The original Ren and Stimpy had been great, partly because the studio imposed constraints that Kricfalusi worked against. Without those constraints, given complete creative freedom, he produced something that many former fans found unwatchable. The lesson that creative freedom without creative discipline produces not liberation but formlessness is worth carrying into the rest of this conversation. I want to go back to something I said earlier about speed because I don't think I gave it quite enough weight. The 6-day production cycle tends to get discussed in terms of logistics, how impressive it is, how grueling it must be. But there's an artistic consequence to it that matters more than the logistics, and it doesn't get said enough. Most television comedy, most comedy in any format, gets softened through revision. A joke that would make the creator personally uncomfortable gets smoothed out in the second draft, made safer in the third, transformed into something that the whole room can agree on by the time it reaches air. That smoothing process is where the edge goes, not because anyone is trying to remove the edge, but because the edge is sharp and the revision process is a series of people handling the sharp thing and instinctively adjusting their grip. South Park doesn't have time for that. The edge stays sharp because no one has time to sand it down. When Parker and Stone make a decision about what a given episode is saying, that decision goes to air, essentially as made, 6 days later. The speed enforces a kind of creative honesty that slower production would erode. The show sounds like what its creators actually think because they don't have time to reconsider. Now imagine trying to copy that. You can copy the topic, you can copy the target. You can even try to copy the willingness to be uncomfortable. But if you're working on a normal animation production schedule, 8 or 9 months per episode, you have 8 or 9 months to second guess everything. The second guessing happens, the comfort takes over. The result is a show that sounds like what the creators thought they thought, filtered through 8 months of managed expectation. Drawn Together had a normal production schedule. The Good Family had a normal production schedule. Moral Orel had a normal production schedule. Every American imitator of South Park had a normal production schedule. The only show in the South Park wave that produced anything with consistent creative urgency was South Park itself, because urgency was baked into the production model in a way that nothing else could replicate. The international comparison is illuminating here too. 2D TV, the British animated topical comedy I mentioned in the international section, operated on a fast production schedule because topical comedy requires it. You can't comment on this week's news if you need 9 months to produce the comment. The show had genuine edge because the speed enforced it. It also burned out quickly, partly because the fast production cycle is genuinely difficult to sustain, and partly because topical comedy has an expiration date that character-based comedy doesn't. But the edge was real while it was there. There's something almost paradoxical about the 6-day cycle that I think is worth sitting with. The speed that produces the creative honesty also limits the depth of any individual episode. You can't build a fully realized fictional world in 6 days. You can't do the kind of deep character work that, say, Moral Orel's 3rd season did, because Moral Orel's 3rd season required time. Time to sit with the characters, time to think about what they were, time to make creative decisions that would have been different if the creators had been forced to act immediately. South Park trades depth for urgency. And for nearly 3 decades, that trade has worked. The audience doesn't come to South Park for deep character work. or they didn't until the show started providing it anyway, starting in the later seasons when Kenny's mythology became genuinely affecting, and Cartman's complexity deepened in ways no one expected in 1997. The audience comes for the joke that nobody else made about the thing that happened this week. And that joke keeps coming on a 6-day cycle for 28 seasons. No imitator could build that machine. The machine was purpose-built for one show by the people who made that show, and it works because of the specific combination of their instincts and their production philosophy and their Comedy Central deal, which has given them an extraordinary level of creative autonomy for an extraordinary length of time. You can't license any of that. You can only watch the machine keep running and wonder what it would take to build something like it. Let me start with the most direct comparison, the most obvious case. The show that didn't just occupy the same general space as South Park, but occupied the same network, the same demographic, and, for a while, nearly the same ratings. Drawn Together premiered on Comedy Central on the 27th of October, 2004. It was created by two writers named Dave Jezer and Matt Silverstein, and the premise is, I'll be honest, genuinely clever on paper. 8 cartoon characters from completely different animation traditions. A Disney-style princess, a superhero, a Japanese monster-catching creature clearly meant to evoke Pikachu, a 1930s black-and-white cartoon character, a He-Man type fantasy hero, a fairy, an anime girl, and a pig, are all placed into a house together in the format of a reality television program, specifically The Real World. Comedy Central's official tagline was a direct parody of that show's tagline. Find out what happens when cartoon characters stop being polite and start making out in hot tubs. The concept had layers to it, theoretically. You had parody of classic cartoon genres, you had parody of reality television, you had a container for all kinds of shock humor. The character designs were done by Jordan Young, a storyboard artist who'd worked on The Simpsons, and the animation was produced by Rough Draft Studios, the same studio that made Futurama, incidentally, which gives you a sense of the technical level of the production. The show landed, and by some measures it landed well. Through most of its run, Drawn Together was the second highest rated program on Comedy Central, behind only South Park. Some individual episodes came close to matching South Park's viewership numbers. By the metric that matters most to networks, how many people are watching, Drawn Together was not a failure, not even close. And yet, Comedy Central declined to order a 4th season in late 2006, somewhere in the middle of the first half of season 3. They didn't officially cancel it, they just stopped ordering episodes. For over a year, the show existed in an ambiguous limbo state, not renewed, not canceled, just quietly suspended in the gap between those two states. In March 2008, a cast member named Tara Strong confirmed publicly that the show was over. According to Jezer and Silverstein, Comedy Central never officially told them the show was canceled. They found out the same way everyone else found out, from the lack of a new order. The reason given, when explanations eventually filtered out, was production costs. The show was expensive to make, and while the ratings were solid, the profit margins after production costs were less impressive than they looked from the outside. That's a plausible explanation. It may even be the true one. But I think there's something else worth sitting with here, which is what the show actually was, and why even its most devoted fans found it difficult to defend it with any particular conviction. Drawn Together was trying to be South Park, not in the sense of copying the visual aesthetic or the small-town setting. Those elements weren't part of its concept, but it was trying to occupy the same psychic territory. It wanted to be the show that went further than anyone else. The show that would take a joke to places other shows wouldn't. The shock comedy that made South Park's shock comedy look conservative by comparison. And it did technically do that. The content of Drawn Together, and I'm not going to list specifics because we'd be here for an hour just doing that, was aggressive in a way that pushed past what South Park was doing at the time. But here's the thing that the show never quite worked out. South Park's shock comedy is shock comedy with a direction. The offensive material is pointed at something, it's aimed, it's doing the work of satire, even when the satire is crude or imprecise. Drawn Together's shock comedy was shock comedy for its own sake. The show was interested in being offensive and in being funny, but it wasn't particularly interested in saying anything. The individual jokes could be funny, the premises of individual episodes could be genuinely inventive, but there was no consistent point underneath the shock. It was the shock and the shock alone. The show knew this on some level. And I find that actually quite interesting because the self-awareness is there if you look for it. The best evidence of it comes not from the series itself, but from the 2010 direct-to-DVD film, The Drawn Together movie. The movie, which if you've never seen it, is partially a feature film and partially an extended argument about why Drawn Together deserved to exist. In the movie, the housemates discover that their show has been canceled and replaced by a program called Suck My Taint, which is an explicit, shot-by-shot parody of South Park. The Suck My Taint girl is a small, round, cartoonish child with strong Cartman energy, who delivers social commentary with every joke. She's clearly meant to represent South Park, and the movie's central conflict is that the Drawn Together cast needs to travel to Make a Point Land and get a point from a wizard so that they can justify their existence and get back on the air. When they arrive and the wizard offers them a point, the housemates refuse it. They don't want a point. They want the right to be funny without one. It's a fascinating moment. The film is arguing, quite explicitly, that shock comedy doesn't need to have a point to be valid. That the requirement to mean something is itself an unfair standard that only gets applied to shows like Drawn Together and not to other kinds of entertainment. It's a legitimate argument, philosophically speaking. You can have a real conversation about whether comedy has to have a point to be worthwhile. But the choice to make that argument in the context of explaining why their show was canceled in favor of a South Park parody reveals something the film didn't intend to reveal, which is that the show's creators were aware, clearly, consciously aware, that South Park was the standard against which they were being measured, and that the measurement was coming up short, not because of the shock value, because of the absence of the target. The animation for the series was produced at Rough Draft Studios' Korea facility, with creative oversight from the American production team. The voice cast included Tara Strong, Jess Harnell, Adam Carolla, Cree Summer, and several other recognizable names from American animation. By the production standards of the time, it was a professionally made show. The problem wasn't the budget or the studio. The problem was the philosophy. There's also a small, telling detail from the show's history that I think about sometimes. When Jeezer and Silverstein were first developing Drawn Together, they pitched it around. Their own agent, and this is apparently a documented story, told them it was the worst idea he'd ever heard. The concept was temporarily shelved. It was revived when a Simpsons storyboard artist named Jordan Young came to the creators seeking career advice, and they offered him character design work in exchange. Young designed the characters, the show got pitched again with his designs attached, and Comedy Central bought it. The original pitch was rejected by the creator's own representation. Young's character designs made it sellable, which is a slightly unusual origin story for a show whose eventual defense of itself was that it didn't need to justify anything about what it was. 3 seasons, a direct-to-video movie, a show that was, by ratings alone, a genuine success, and yet couldn't survive on a network that was simultaneously airing one of the biggest shows in cable television history. The show that wanted to out South Park ended up writing a movie about how unfair it was that South Park's approach had worked better than theirs. No notes, really, just a fairly honest portrait of what happens when you copy the surface of something without the substance underneath. There's a specific detail about Drawn Together's production history that I keep coming back to, because it says something about the gap between the show's commercial performance and its critical standing that a simple ratings discussion doesn't capture. The show was consistently, and I mean consistently across most of its 3-season run, the second highest rated program on Comedy Central, behind South Park, which at this point was an institution which had been on the network for 7 years by the time Drawn Together premiered, which had a level of cultural penetration that Comedy Central had never achieved with anything else. Being the second highest rated show behind South Park was genuinely impressive. It meant the audience was there. It meant the show was doing something right, commercially. But here's the thing about being the second best version of a thing. It's a position that's difficult to defend because the person in first place doesn't have to change anything to defeat you. South Park didn't need to respond to Drawn Together. It didn't need to adjust. It just had to keep being South Park. And as long as South Park kept being South Park, Drawn Together would always be the edgier, less purposeful thing airing earlier in the same evening. The show's creators have spoken in the years since about the experience of developing and running Drawn Together. And the picture that emerges is of people who were genuinely creative and genuinely invested in what they were making, operating under the perpetual shadow of a comparison they couldn't control. Every review of Drawn Together mentioned South Park. Every discussion of the show's place in Comedy Central's lineup mentioned South Park. The show had built its own audience, found its own creative register, and was still being evaluated primarily as a variation on something else. There's genuine sympathy to be had for that position. South Park set a standard on that network that made everything else look like a footnote by comparison. Drawn Together wasn't trying to be a footnote. The creators had a genuine comedic vision, even if that vision was, as I argued earlier, less coherent than South Park's in terms of having something to say. The problem wasn't that they were lazy. The problem was that they were genuinely funny people who'd built a funny show and couldn't figure out how to make it mean something. And meaning something was the one thing the network's other hit did that theirs didn't. The voice cast, by the way, was strong throughout. Tara Strong, Jess Harnell, Cree Summer, Adam Carolla, Bambi Woods. These are experienced, capable voice actors. The writing had real wit in individual episodes, even in the seasons where the larger creative direction was uncertain. There's a version of a retrospective about Drawn Together that's more charitable than the dominant narrative, that acknowledges the genuine comedic ability in the room alongside the structural absence of purpose. I want to name that version, even if it doesn't change the conclusion. 3 seasons, a movie that was simultaneously funny and bitter. A MySpace page that asked fans to call Comedy Central and demand a new season. Creators who reportedly found out the show was canceled from a cast member's public confirmation rather than from the network directly. That's a fairly undignified ending for a show that was, by viewership, one of the most successful things on the network. Comedy Central is not the last word on the value of what Drawn Together was trying to do. But it is the last word on whether the show got to keep trying. The movie exists. The 3 seasons exist. They're findable if you look for them, late night on Comedy Central's secondary blocks, or in the corners of the streaming platforms that pick up older catalog content. Some people love them. The people who love them tend to love them with the specific fondness you have for things that were made for you specifically and weren't trying to be anything else. That's not nothing, even if it's not South Park. Now let's talk about a show that nobody ever accused of being a South Park ripoff exactly, but which was attempting something so closely related to what South Park does that it belongs in this conversation anyway. The Good Family aired on ABC beginning May 27, 2009. It was created by Mike Judge and Greg Daniels. Mike Judge, the man who made Beavis and Butthead, the show that Parker and Stone have explicitly credited as one of their primary influences. The man who made King of the Hill, which ran on Fox for 13 seasons and is one of the most genuinely warm pieces of American television of that era. Greg Daniels, who co-created King of the Hill alongside Judge and later adapted The Office for American television. These are not people who don't know what they're doing. The premise of The Good Family is this: a family of very enthusiastic, very sincere, very self-congratulating liberals living in a generic American suburb. Gerald Good, the father, drives a hybrid car that doesn't work particularly well. The family's dog is named Che, after Che Guevara, naturally, and is kept on a strict vegan diet, which is slowly starving it to death because dogs are not built to be vegan. When a neighbor's dog visits, Che erupts into predatory violence and then slinks back to looking malnourished and guilty. The family adopts an exchange student they assume is going to be African because they want to demonstrate their commitment to diversity, and then discover he's a blonde South African teenager whose family came to America for the same reason. Helen Good, the mother, tries desperately to say the right thing about everything and constantly overshoots into absurdity. The targets: performative environmentalism, well-intentioned racial politics that produce the opposite of their intended effect, the particular kind of liberal self-congratulation that's more about identity than outcome. These are all targets South Park has gone after repeatedly. Parker and Stone have done entire episodes about the logical endpoints of liberal pieties, episodes that were clearly aimed at their own audience's politics. The Good Family was attempting the same maneuver. The show lasted 13 episodes. ABC moved it to Saturdays at 9 p.m. partway through its run, which in broadcast television is the polite way of saying we've given up on this, but we have to air it somewhere. It did not get a second season. The obvious question is why, given the pedigree and the premise. And I think the honest answer has a couple of parts. The first part is a structural problem. South Park can go after liberal and conservative politics with equal aggression in the same episode. It's an equal opportunity satirist, and that equivalence is part of what gives it credibility. If you're going to mock someone's deeply held political positions, it helps if your audience can see that you'd mock the other side's positions with the same enthusiasm. The Good Family aimed almost exclusively at one political direction. It wasn't balanced, it was pointed at a specific set of targets and not at anything else, which meant that the audience the show was making fun of didn't want to watch it, and the audience that agreed with the show's politics also didn't want to watch it because they were the targets. You end up without either constituency. The second part is a network mismatch. ABC in 2009 was not Comedy Central. The audience ABC was building its primetime lineup around was not the same audience that found South Park's approach to political incorrectness liberating. ABC's primetime audience tended, broadly speaking, toward the political positions the Good Family was satirizing. The show was essentially making fun of its own host network's most reliable viewers at a primetime Saturday night slot on a network that depended on those viewers' loyalty. Judge has spoken about the cancellation with the kind of equanimity that suggests he'd already made his peace with it. He's mentioned that the timing was off, that the cultural moment had shifted by the time the show reached air. He developed the concept some years before it premiered, and the political climate in 2009 was a different thing than the climate he'd been writing for. These things happen. A show can be developed for a world that no longer quite exists by the time it's broadcast. What I find genuinely interesting about The Good Family in the context of this whole conversation is what it demonstrates about the specificity of South Park's satirical position. Parker and Stone built a show that has no natural political home. Neither side can claim it. Both sides have been its target. That homelessness, that refusal to land on a side, is actually a significant part of why the show has lasted as long as it has. It doesn't belong to a constituency that can age out or shift. An imitator trying to do what South Park does, but with a consistent political direction, will always be limited by the size and reliability of the audience that agrees with that direction. The Good Family knew what it was trying to do. The craft was there, the writers were experienced, the character designs were clean and distinct. It just aimed at a narrower target than South Park had, and the resulting show couldn't sustain itself on that alone. 13 episodes and gone. Mike Judge went back to other things. Greg Daniels went on to make Parks and Recreation. The Good Family became the kind of show you find mentioned briefly in retrospectives about animated satire, a footnote that confirms the attempt was made without much else to say about it, right? This one's different. This one I want to take a bit of time with because the story of Moral Orel is the most interesting story in this entire video, and it's interesting in the way that surprises you partway through. Moral Orel started as a South Park clone. It ended as something Adult Swim had never made before, and I'd argue, hasn't quite made since. The show premiered on Adult Swim in December 2005 and was created by Dino Stamatopoulos, a writer who'd worked on Mr. Show with Bob and David, Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and Community. The animation style was claymation, stop-motion clay figures in a format deliberately meant to evoke Davy and Goliath, the old Christian educational series that ran from the 1960s to the 1990s and featured moral lessons delivered through clay animation characters, the most famous of which were a boy named Davy Hansen and his talking dog Goliath. The setup of Moral Orel, a fictional small American town called Moralton, dominated by its church and by a rigid, hypocritical social hierarchy. The main character, Orel Puppington, is a sincere, devout young boy who genuinely believes the moral lessons he's taught at church and at school, and who consistently attempts to apply those lessons to his life. The comedy of the early seasons came from the gap between Orel's sincere application of the lessons and the grotesque outcomes that resulted. Orel takes a lesson about the importance of life and concludes that he should raise the dead. He takes a lesson about prayer and becomes addicted to praying to the point of social dysfunction. He takes a lesson about the body being a temple and interprets it in ways that lead to considerable physical damage. The adults around him are uniformly worse than he is. His father, Clay Puppington, is a functional alcoholic who projects his self-loathing onto the people nearest to him. His mother, Blaberta, married Clay for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and has been quietly collapsing ever since. The town's pastor is pompous and self-interested. The neighbors are various flavors of corrupt. Aurel is surrounded by adults who have absorbed the same moral teachings he has and chosen universally to disregard them in practice. The South Park influence here is visible and acknowledged. Small town, child protagonist, grotesque adult behavior, religious hypocrisy as a satirical target. South Park had been doing all of this since 1997. Moral Aurel in its early seasons was clearly working from the same template. It was darker than South Park, more uncomfortable in its humor, less interested in finding its way back to a comedic equilibrium at the end of each episode. But the DNA was related. The third season turned out to be a different kind of show entirely. Adult Swim cut Moral Aurel's episode order. The third season was originally planned for 13 episodes. Somewhere in the process, the network reduced that to 6. The reasons given at the time were vague. Stamatopoulos and his team used those 6 episodes to do something that nobody involved in an Adult Swim animated comedy had done before. At least not at that scale. They told a complete story. The third season of Moral Aurel is structured as a series of episodes, each focusing on a different character from the town's ensemble. Not Aurel, or not only Aurel, the season peels back the surface of Moralton one character at a time, showing you the interior life of people who had previously existed as background figures or one-note jokes. You learn how Clay Puppington became who he is. You learn the specific shape of Bloberta's unhappiness. You learn that essentially every adult in this town is the product of the same cycle, of parents who failed them the way they're failing their own children, stretching back through generations. The season's central episode is called Sacrifice, and it aired in December 2008 as the show's final regular episode before a holiday special ended the run. Sacrifice follows Clay on a hunting trip that goes badly wrong. It is not a funny episode. It is barely trying to be funny. It is a portrait of a man who has spent his entire life substituting alcohol and anger for the emotional honesty he's incapable of, and who has, in the space of one awful weekend, caused damage to his son that will not be repaired. The episode was praised by critics and animation writers in terms that you would not typically use for a 12-minute Adult Swim claymation show. Here's what I find genuinely moving about the arc of Moral Aurel, and I say that as someone who thinks the early seasons were only intermittently good. The show started by doing what everyone else was doing, using the South Park template, using the child as container, using the small town as a backdrop for adult dysfunction played for laughs. And then it noticed something about that template that almost nobody else noticed. It noticed that if you actually take seriously the emotional reality of a child surrounded by broken adults, if you stop using that reality purely for comedy and start asking what it would really mean to be Aurel Puppington, the result isn't funny at all. The result is devastating. South Park, for all of its brilliance, protects its characters. Cartman can be monstrous, but Cartman is also invincible in the sense that the show never really makes you reckon with what it would mean to grow up as Eric Cartman. Stan can have an identity crisis, Kenny can die 100 times, Kyle can be the moral conscience of the group and have nobody listen to him. But the show snaps back. The boys are always at the bus stop the next morning. The emotional weight is managed, contained, kept within the range that the comedic format can handle. Moral Aurel stopped managing it. It let the weight out. And what came out in those final episodes was something that the South Park template wasn't designed to carry. The show won an Annie Award Jury Prize for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Animation in 2008. It is mentioned in virtually every serious discussion of what Adult Swim was capable of producing during its creative peak. It is also genuinely forgotten by large portions of the audience that were watching Adult Swim at the time because it aired late, in a slot that didn't draw the casual viewers who were there for Aqua Teen Hunger Force or Family Guy reruns. 2 seasons of South Park-adjacent dark comedy, 6 episodes of something else entirely. That's Moral Aurel. And I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets in these kinds of retrospectives, not because it was a great show from beginning to end. It wasn't. But because of what it figured out in the final act. It figured out that the South Park template, if you apply it with full emotional honesty instead of comedic distance, produces tragedy rather than satire. And it had the nerve to follow that observation all the way to its conclusion. Not many shows do that. And it started out as a knockoff. That's the part I keep coming back to. I want to come back to Moral Orel for a moment because I left something out earlier and I think it's important. The show's end, the reduction in episode count, was presented at the time as a network decision. Adult Swim cut the order, and the creators used what remained to produce the show's most ambitious work. But there's a version of events, according to people close to the production, in which the reduction was not entirely unwelcome. Stamatopoulos had been working on a show that was getting darker and more emotionally serious with each season. And there's a point at which a show that started as a dark comedy either commits fully to the darkness or retreats back to the comedy. The reduction in episode count forced a commitment. It made the question of what to do with the remaining episodes urgent in a way that a full 13-episode order wouldn't have. What's remarkable about those final episodes, watching them now, is how completely they've transcended the context in which they were made. You can watch the first 2 seasons of Moral Orel and experience them as a sharp but limited piece of Adult Swim shot comedy in the South Park tradition. You can then watch the 3rd season and experience it as something else entirely, as a genuine exploration of generational trauma, of the way parents pass damage to children in the guise of love, of the specific cruelty of American religious community when it turns inward and uses faith as a weapon. Those are not the themes of an Adult Swim shot comedy. Those are the themes of a serious dramatic work. They arrived in a 12-minute stop-motion animated format that Adult Swim was airing at midnight on weeknights. Dino Stamatopoulos, in interviews after the show ended, has expressed a complicated relationship with its legacy. On one hand, the final season is genuinely considered one of the best things Adult Swim ever produced, and that assessment is not wrong. On the other hand, the show as a complete object, 3 seasons, the canceled 4th that never arrived, is truncated. The story it was telling in the 3rd season isn't finished. The characters are left mid-arc in a way that the 6-episode finale couldn't resolve because a 6-episode finale wasn't enough space to complete a story that had been building for 3 seasons. There's a specific character note that I find genuinely affecting. Orel, at the end of the series, in a holiday special that served as a kind of coda, is shown as an adult. He's married to a girl from town who understood him, and they have children together. He's sitting with his family, and he's fine. He's not defined by what was done to him. He grew up, and he became something his parents couldn't imagine being, despite everything they did and didn't do. It's a quietly happy ending for a character who spent 3 seasons being systematically failed by every adult in his life. The show earned that ending. It earned it by not pretending the failure didn't happen, by showing the failure in the fullest detail the format allowed, and then showing that the failure wasn't the whole story. A child can be failed and still become something good. That idea in a show about a claymation boy in a fictional American town has more emotional weight than most adult dramas manage in 10 hours. It started as a South Park clone. That part deserves saying again because it's actually relevant to what the show became. The South Park template, children as containers, small town as microcosm, adult dysfunction as comedy, turned out to be a container that could hold something much heavier than comedy if you applied enough pressure. Moral Orel applied that pressure until the container changed shape. The result was something the template wasn't designed to produce, which is tragedy. But it was also something that the template, in a roundabout way, had made possible. Without the distance that the animated format creates, without the way that claymation in particular holds emotion at a slight remove that allows the audience to sustain it without being overwhelmed, the 3rd season of Moral Orel might have been unwatchable. The format protected the audience enough to let the content in. That's a strange gift to trace back to Trey Parker and Matt Stone's paper cutouts, but there it is. Since we're on the topic of Comedy Central's various attempts to find something that could coexist with South Park in the same programming space, let me talk about Ugly Americans, because it's a show I have a real soft spot for, even though I think it never quite became what it was trying to be. Ugly Americans premiered on Comedy Central in March 2010 and ran for 2 seasons, 31 episodes, before being canceled in 2012. It was created by Devin Clark and developed by David M. Stern, based on Clark's own comic strip of the same name. The premise is one of those ideas that sounds absurd until you think about it for a moment and realize there's actually something there. Alternate New York City. The city is populated not just by humans, but by thousands of supernatural creatures. Demons, zombies, wizards, werewolves, man-birds, shadowy aliens. who have immigrated from their respective dimensions and are trying to integrate into normal urban American life. The main character, Mark Lilly, is a human social worker employed by the Department of Integration. His job is to help monster immigrants navigate the bureaucracy, fill out the right forms, find housing, attend orientation. His roommate is a zombie named Randall, who is charming and unreliable in equal measure. His girlfriend is a succubus named Callie, who is half demon and has complicated family dynamics involving actual Satan. His boss is a wizard named Twain the Boneropper, who is very attached to the dignity of his title despite the obvious difficulties this creates. The show is funny. The basic comic engine, treating the supernatural as an immigration and social services problem, applying the bland procedural language of American bureaucracy to monsters, is genuinely inventive and consistently produces good jokes. The animation style, inspired by EC Comics, the 1950s horror anthology publisher responsible for Tales from the Crypt, is visually distinct. Nobody else was animating adult comedy in that visual register at the time. And yet, I think Ugly Americans is the clearest example in this wave of a show that had a great concept, genuine wit, real comedic ideas, and still couldn't find its footing within the time it was given. Reviews were mild, the ratings were decent without being impressive. The animation style, which critics frequently described as interesting in theory, turned out to have a practical problem. It didn't move particularly well. EC Comics artwork is detailed and static. Translating that aesthetic into animation meant producing visuals that felt slightly stiff, even by the standards of limited animation. And stiffness in animation makes comedy harder. Jokes depend on timing. Timing depends on movement. The aesthetic the show chose made movement difficult. There's also a version of the South Park question that applies here. Ugly Americans was doing social commentary. Immigration, integration, cultural difference, bureaucratic indifference to human and monster suffering through the lens of the supernatural. That's a South Park move. South Park frequently literalizes metaphors. It makes the thing a metaphor is pointing at into an actual physical presence in the show. Ugly Americans was doing something similar with immigrant experience in New York City, and in its better episodes, the monster as immigrant framing produced real comic insight. But the show never committed fully to what that framing was saying. It kept retreating to character comedy and workplace dynamics, whenever the social commentary got close to having a genuine edge. The result was a show that felt like it was perpetually on the verge of saying something and never quite saying it. South Park at its best says the thing and then deals with the consequences. Ugly Americans approached the thing, circled it, made jokes in its general vicinity, and moved on. I'll be honest about something though. 2 seasons is not much time for a show with this level of conceptual ambition to find its voice. Most shows that have become genuinely beloved needed more than 31 episodes to figure out what they were. Bob's Burgers was middling in its first season and extraordinary by its 4th. It got the time to become itself. Ugly Americans was canceled before it had the same opportunity. The show has genuine fans. They're quieter than the fans of other shows in this conversation, partly because Ugly Americans never had the cultural footprint to produce the kind of vocal fandom that a show like South Park sustains. But they exist, and they're right that the show had real ideas in it. 31 episodes, 2 seasons, gone in 2012. The monster immigration premise went with it, unresolved, into the part of the television archive that only very specific people visit. Let me shift gears here because Superjail is a slightly different kind of thing. Superjail premiered on Adult Swim in October 2007. It was created by Christy Caracas and Stephen Warbrick, and it ran for 4 seasons before ending in 2014. The premise, briefly, a surreal, psychedelic prison existing in a pocket dimension, run by a childlike and intensely enthusiastic warden whose facility has no coherent rules and no discernible connection to any real-world justice system. The inmates are there because they're there. The staff are there because they're there. Every episode, something catalyzes. A new inmate arrives, a contraband item gets loose, some external force intrudes on the prison's impossible internal logic. And the episode builds toward a sequence. That sequence is the whole point. The Superjail sequence, in every episode, had one of varying length, usually running several minutes, was a mass of animated carnage. thousands of inmates dying in hundreds of different ways simultaneously, rendered in fluid, frenetic, genuinely beautiful hand-drawn animation. The violence in these sequences was so extreme and so elaborately choreographed that it crossed from disturbing into something closer to kinetic art. The show was doing something aesthetically that no other adult animated program was doing. It was treating violence as spectacle in the way that action films treat violence as choreography, not as something to react to morally, but as something to experience visually. The South Park connection here is oblique, but real. South Park demonstrated that animation could go to places that live-action television wouldn't go, that the cartoon format's apparent innocence could be used as cover for content that would be unwatchable otherwise. Super Jail absorbed that permission and used it for something entirely different. It wasn't interested in satire, it wasn't interested in social commentary, it was interested in what you could do with the unlimited visual vocabulary of hand-drawn animation when you removed all conventional restraints on content. The result was a show that found a devoted Adult Swim cult audience and held it for 4 seasons. Super Jail never pretended to be more than it was. It had a consistent aesthetic vision, it executed that vision with genuine craft, and it never tried to mean something it didn't mean. In a wave of shows that constantly overreached, that tried to be South Park without understanding what made South Park work, Super Jail underreached in a way that was somehow more honest. It wasn't trying to be anything except Super Jail. The violence is genuinely not for everyone. I want to be clear about that. The show's creative decisions produce content that is, by design, disturbing. If you've never seen it and you're imagining something in the register of Tom and Jerry cartoon violence, adjust that expectation significantly upward. It's not Tom and Jerry, it's something else. But the show knew exactly what it was, and 4 seasons on Adult Swim, building a real audience on very specific terms, is a different kind of success than a flashy premiere and a quick cancellation. Of all the shows in this video, Super Jail is the one that most clearly had a creative identity it never abandoned. That's worth something. Let me move from Super Jail to a show that was doing something superficially similar, but operating from a completely different starting point. Mr. Pickles premiered on Adult Swim in September 2013 and ran for 4 seasons, ending in 2019. It was created by Will Carsola and Dave Stewart. The premise: a 1950s-style small American town called Old Town. A nuclear family in the classic suburban mold. A grandfather, a father and mother, a small boy, a grandmother. And the family's dog, Mr. Pickles, who is a border collie. Mr. Pickles appears to the family to be an extraordinarily devoted and well-behaved pet. To the viewer, Mr. Pickles is immediately and obviously a satanic entity operating under deep cover. The gap between what the family believes about their dog and what the dog actually is provides the show's core comedic engine. The family is oblivious. The grandfather is suspicious. He's the one character who seems to perceive something wrong with Mr. Pickles, and nobody believes him. The dog, meanwhile, commits acts of extreme, graphic violence in episodes structured so that the family never quite witnesses the evidence. The South Park connection here runs through the small-town setting and the surface, wholesomeness concealing, darkness dynamic. South Park has returned to that dynamic regularly across its run. The idea that the seemingly ordinary American small town is actually the container for things far more disturbing than its surface suggests. Moral Orel worked with the same dynamic. Mr. Pickles was working with it too, but in a horror register rather than a satirical one. The show had fans, a genuine following. 4 seasons on Adult Swim isn't an accident. You need consistent viewership to get 4 seasons on that block. The creative team knew their audience and delivered what that audience wanted with reliable consistency. The violence was extreme in the way Super Jail's violence was extreme, but less aesthetically ambitious. More interested in what was happening than in how it looked. The animation style was loose and slightly ugly in a way that seemed deliberate, meant to evoke the uncanny discomfort of something that looks like a children's show and isn't one. The show's aging tells you something specific about where the formula runs out. Even within its own run, reviews in the later seasons noted a quality that's worth naming clearly. Shock comedy without satirical content gets repetitive faster than satirical comedy does. When the joke is always, this dog is doing something terrible and the family doesn't know. And when there's no deeper target, no institution, no behavior, no cultural hypocrisy the show is satirizing, The joke's lifespan is limited by how long the audience can sustain interest in its pure execution without something else to hold on to. South Park can run for nearly 3 decades because the targets change. Every week, there's something new in the world to point at. Mr. Pickles was pointing at the same thing every episode: the contrast between the dog's appearance and the dog's reality. That's a one-joke premise, executed with craft and consistency, and it has a natural ceiling. By season 4, the reviews were noting that the show had largely maxed out what the premise could productively do. This is one of the cleaner illustrations of why the South Park formula's target component is so essential. Without a moving target, without something new to say, shock comedy finds its limit. The limit isn't the audience's tolerance for shock. Audiences have a remarkably high tolerance for shock if the shock is well executed. The limit is the audience's tolerance for surprise, and surprise is the only thing shock comedy runs on. Once the audience knows exactly what to expect, the shock stops working. Mr. Pickles knew what it was and committed to it. That's genuinely admirable. But what it was had a shorter shelf life than the show ran for, and you can see that in the arc of its critical reception across 4 seasons, 40 episodes. Gone in 2019. The family never figured out what their dog was. The grandfather went to his grave unsatisfied. The show ended without resolving its central mystery, which is either a feature or a bug, depending on your relationship to that particular approach. Here's a fun one. Here's a show that almost nobody would describe as a South Park ripoff, and which I'm including in this conversation anyway because it's one of the clearest examples of what happens when you take a single component of the South Park formula, just one, and build an entire creative identity around it. Happy Tree Friends started in 1999 as a series of internet flash animations originally created by Aubrey Ankrum, Rode Montijo, Ken Navarro, and Warren Graff for Mondo Media. The first episodes went online in early 2000, which is worth pausing on for a moment. This was 2000. The internet did not have the infrastructure that it has now. Streaming video, as we understand it, didn't exist. These animations were small flash files that you downloaded or that loaded extremely slowly in a browser window, and people shared them via email and instant messaging and the early iteration of web forums because they couldn't share them any other way. And people did share them extensively because the concept is brilliant in its simplicity. The premise? Extremely cute, brightly colored cartoon animals living in a cheerful, pastel-colored forest world. The visual aesthetic is aggressively adorable. The characters have large round eyes and small round bodies and move with the bouncy, cheerful energy of classic children's animation. Their names are things like Cuddles, Giggles, Flaky, Toothy, Lumpy. The world they inhabit looks, at first glance, like the sort of thing you might show to a small child without concern. And then someone dies, horribly, in graphic detail, in a way that the visual style makes somehow worse by contrast with the surrounding cheerfulness. The gap between aesthetic and content is the whole joke, and it's a joke that never fully exhausted itself across the series' run because the show was endlessly creative in its deployment. The deaths were varied, inventive, often surprisingly elaborate, and executed with the same cheerful visual language that surrounded them. Every episode was essentially a cartoon that had forgotten what kind of cartoon it was supposed to be. The South Park DNA here is not in the structure or the satire. Happy Tree Friends had no political targets and no social commentary. It's in the fundamental concept of using a child-friendly container for adult content. South Park uses elementary school children. Happy Tree Friends uses cute woodland creatures. The principle is the same: create a tension between the format's expected register and the content's actual register, and let the gap between those two things generate comedy. What Happy Tree Friends demonstrated, and this is actually quite significant historically, is that this principle could work without any of the other elements of the South Park formula. No plot, no satire, no character development, no target. Just the tension between cute and horrifying, executed reliably for 2 minutes at a time. The online numbers were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. The series accumulated viewing totals that were genuinely staggering for the era, eventually reaching into the billions across platforms. A DVD was released, merchandise was produced. A television version ran on G4 from 2006 to 2008, shortened to fill broadcast slots and partially censored, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive editorial decision imaginable, given that the violence was the entire point of the show. The internet version continued through 2016. The timing is one of the more interesting details in this whole story. Happy Tree Friends was finding its audience in 2000, 2001, 2002, the period when South Park was establishing its cultural presence but hadn't yet produced the wave of imitators that would follow. Happy Tree Friends wasn't responding to South Park's success. It was arriving at similar territory from a completely different direction, independently, which makes it arguably one of the more original shows in this whole conversation, despite being described here in the context of what South Park inspired. The show never had the cultural conversation around it that South Park generates. It never won awards. Critics didn't particularly engage with it because it existed in a format, internet video, that mainstream critics weren't paying attention to in the early 2000s. Its audience was self-selecting, found through peer sharing, and largely invisible to the metrics that traditional media use to measure success. But by the metric of total viewership over the life of the series, Happy Tree Friends was successful in a way that most of the other shows in this conversation simply weren't. It found its audience and kept it for 16 years. That's not an accident. That's a creative idea that worked reliably over a very long time, executed with enough consistency that people kept coming back. Cute cartoon animals, graphic violence, no other ambition, no notes. There's a dimension to the Happy Tree Friends story that the section above touched on but didn't fully explore, which is what the show's success tells us about the relationship between audience and creator in the pre-YouTube internet. The early 2000s internet had no recommendation algorithm. There was no feed that surfaced content based on your watch history. There was no trending page. If you found something online and liked it, you had two options. You bookmarked it and came back to it, or you emailed the link to someone. That's it. The distribution mechanism was purely human. Content spread because individual people decided to pass it on. What that meant practically is that the content that spread was content that people felt strongly enough about to personally vouch for. Not just content they enjoyed passively. Content they wanted someone else to experience. The distinction matters. You email a link to someone because you think their reaction will be worth seeing, or because you want to share the experience of encountering the thing, or because it expresses something you couldn't express yourself. The content that circulated through the early internet was content that passed that specific threshold. Happy Tree Friends passed it because the reaction it produced was intense and immediate and shareable. The gap between the cute aesthetic and the violent content was the kind of thing you wanted someone else to experience in real time. You sent the link, they opened it, they had a reaction. The reaction was the whole point. That loop, create content, trigger reaction, trigger the desire to pass the reaction on, is what drove the show's extraordinary reach in an era with no infrastructure for viral distribution. South Park had worked in part on the same principle in its early years. Parker and Stone's Spirit of Christmas tape circulated by hand for the same reason. People wanted others to experience the specific reaction the tape produced. The content was transgressive in a way that invited sharing. Watching it alone was different from watching it with someone who'd never seen it before. The show carried that social dimension into its television run, where it generated conversations and controversies and debates that extended far beyond the 30 minutes of content in any given episode. The shows that failed to generate that social dimension, the ones that were just watched, processed, and forgotten, tended to fail commercially as well. Not because the social dimension is a prerequisite for good television. Some of the best television ever made has passed quietly through the world without generating much conversation. But in the specific ecosystem that South Park and its imitators were operating in, the shows that generated talk sustained their audiences, and the shows that didn't quietly lost them. Ugly Americans was watched by its fans, but not talked about by them the way South Park fans talked about South Park. Drawn Together generated controversy, but not the kind of creative conversation that sustains a long-running show. Chosen generated almost no conversation at all, which contributed to it not finding the audience it needed to survive. Happy Tree Friends generated conversation of a very specific kind. Have you seen this thing where cute animals die horribly? That sustained a fan community for 16 years. The conversation was narrow but intense, and intense conversation is more sustaining than mild conversation at a larger scale. That's a counterintuitive finding, but it's consistent across the history of cult media. The passionate minority is more valuable, long-term, than the mildly interested majority. South Park's fan base is passionate in a way that Drawn Together's never was, and Ugly Americans never could be. The passion comes from investment, from the sense that the show is trying to do something real, that it has a perspective worth engaging with, that the satirical moves it makes are worth arguing about. Argument is a form of passion. Shows that generate argument sustain fans in ways that shows that generate only enjoyment can't. The Drawn Together movie's central complaint, that Drawn Together was canceled in favor of a South Park-style show with a point, is, in a strange way, an acknowledgement of this. The movie is an argument. The argument is passionate. The passion is real. But it arrived too late and aimed at the wrong target. And the show it was arguing for was already gone. Let me take a moment for a show that was brief, specific, and genuinely underestimated. Chosen premiered on FX in January 2014, ran for 14 episodes across one season, and was canceled without renewal. It was created by Grant DeKernian. The premise? Chosen, a gay white rapper who has just been released from prison, navigating the music industry, old rivalries, and his own considerable ego as he attempts to reclaim his position as, in his own assessment, the greatest rapper alive. He has an absolute belief in his own talent that is at least partially justified. He is also very difficult to be around. The voice cast was strong. Bobby Moynihan voiced Chosen. Michael Pena, Nick Cannon, Hannibal Buress, Danny McBride, and Catherine Hahn filled supporting roles. That's a genuinely impressive ensemble for an animated show that most people have never heard of. The South Park influence in Chosen operates through the politically incorrect comedy lens. South Park regularly makes jokes about race, sexuality, and cultural status simultaneously and from multiple directions in ways that are uncomfortable in first contact and often reveal something genuinely observed underneath the discomfort. Chosen was attempting a similar maneuver, putting a gay white rapper in the middle of hip-hop culture and using that central tension to generate comedy that went after multiple things at once. Assumptions about race and authenticity in music. Assumptions about sexuality and masculinity. The specific politics of the music industry. The gap between the self-image a rapper constructs and the reality other people observe. The pilot had energy. The voice performances were committed, especially Moynihan's, whose Chosen was a very specific kind of delusional self-confidence that the show played with consistent irony. The show knew what Chosen was. It wasn't asking the audience to find him admirable. It was asking the audience to find him funny in the way that people who are absolutely certain of their own greatness can be funny when the universe fails to cooperate with their self-assessment. 14 episodes. Canceled. Low ratings were cited. FX moved on. I think Chosen is one of the more unfortunate entries in this whole conversation because it had a premise with real satirical potential, a cast capable of executing that potential, and what reads, from the outside with limited information, like insufficient time to find an audience. 14 episodes is not a lot. An animated comedy with an unusual premise and no pre-existing fan base needs time to develop word of mouth, and word of mouth needs time to translate into viewership numbers. Chosen was canceled before that process could complete. The show wasn't a South Park ripoff in any mechanical sense. It didn't share the visual aesthetic, the small-town setting, the child protagonist, or the rapid production topicality. What it shared was the commitment to comedic discomfort in service of something observed. And that's a valid creative lineage. It just didn't have the time to prove itself. Short section, because there's not much more to say about a show that ended before it fully started. 14 episodes, gone in 2014. Bobby Moynihan went on to other things. The gay white rapper from prison became a footnote. Now let's talk about what was happening outside of America while all of this was going on. Because South Park's influence wasn't limited to American television, and the shows it inspired weren't all made in Los Angeles or New York. The international wave of South Park-adjacent animated comedy is a slightly different story from the American one, partly because the networks involved had different pressures, and partly because the cultural contexts were different enough that the formula's translation produced interesting variations. Let me start in the United Kingdom. Bromwell High aired on Channel 4 in 2005 and 2006. 13 episodes, one season. The show was set in a rough, inner London comprehensive school. Bromwell High clearly meant to evoke the kind of secondary school that exists in every British city but rarely appears in television that's comfortable to watch. The main characters were three teenage girls, Natella, Kezia, and Latrina. The comedy targeted the dysfunctions of the British education system, the class dynamics of urban schooling, the gap between official institutional language and actual daily reality in a school where the teachers are as badly behaved as the students. The South Park comparison was made immediately in British press coverage when the show premiered. 3 episodes in reviews consistently mentioned South Park. This is partially fair and partially not. Bromwell High was working from a British comedic tradition, the grotesque institutional satire of shows like Drop the Dead Donkey, the dark comedy of British class dynamics, that predates South Park and doesn't really need it as a reference point. The show's targets were specifically British in a way that didn't translate easily. The jokes about Ofsted inspections and league tables and the bureaucratic language of British education reform landed well for an audience that knew that world and fell completely flat for anyone who didn't. 13 episodes, not renewed, the show had real wit, particularly in how it handled the gap between the school's official self-presentation and its actual operation. But it was airing on Channel 4 in a slot that didn't give it much visibility, and the specifically British register of its humor kept it from finding the kind of international distribution that might have extended its life. Now for the more interesting case. Clone High is the Canadian entry in this conversation, and Clone High is significantly more interesting than most of the other shows in this section, because it wasn't really trying to be South Park at all. It was doing something with similar ingredients that produced a completely different result. And understanding why it worked is almost as instructive as understanding why the imitators didn't. Clone High was created by Phil Lord, Christopher Miller, and Bill Lawrence. It premiered in October 2002 on the Canadian channel Teletoon and on MTV in the United States simultaneously. The premise? The United States government has secretly been cloning historical figures and raising them in a suburban American high school to be trained as weapons and then deployed. The clones don't know this, they're just teenagers. JFK is the popular, handsome jock. Cleopatra is the beautiful but emotionally unavailable queen bee. Gandhi is the hyperactive, desperately attention-seeking best friend of the main character. Abraham Lincoln is the earnest, awkward protagonist who's trying to get through high school and maybe ask Cleopatra out. Joan of Arc is the thoughtful, artistic girl he should probably be asking out instead. The show used the high school setting to parody high school movie tropes, using historical figures as exaggerated archetypes of familiar teenage types. The comedy was fast, dense, self-aware, and very funny. Lord and Miller, who would go on to make 21 Jump Street, the Lego Movie, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, were clearly operating at a high level already. The writing had a specific voice that wasn't borrowing from South Park so much as running alongside it in the same general territory of animated comedy that didn't condescend to its audience. Clone High ran for 1 season and was canceled. The cancellation was triggered in part by protests from the Indian government and from Hindu groups who objected to the show's portrayal of Gandhi as a hyperactive party animal. MTV pulled the show in response. The creators had intended to continue it. The season finale ended on a cliffhanger, and the cancellation left that cliffhanger unresolved for 20 years. 20 years later, in 2023, Clone High was revived on HBO Max. New episodes were produced with the original creators. The revival updated the show's sensibility for the 2020s, which produced some creative friction, but also produced genuine moments that showed the original concept still had life in it. The Gandhi portrayal was handled differently in the revival, replacing him with a character named Gandhi, who was explicitly a different historical figure. The cliffhanger from 2002 was resolved. The original season is now considered a cult classic in a way that most of the other shows in this conversation are not. The difference between Clone High and, say, Bromwell High comes down to the thing we keep coming back to in this video. Clone High had a specific creative voice, Lord and Miller's voice, that was doing something with the animated format that felt original rather than derivative. It was working with South Park adjacent ingredients and producing something with its own identity. That identity is what the cult remembers. That identity is why the revival happened. A brief tour of some others in the international wave because they deserve a mention even if they don't each require a full section. Bromwell High covered above. 2DTV, a British animated topical comedy that aired on ITV from 2001 to 2004. Celebrity caricatures delivering political comedy in the South Park vein, using the rapid production schedule that South Park had pioneered in America. The show was genuinely fast and genuinely topical, commenting on current events with a speed that traditional British animation had never managed before. 3 series then canceled. The political caricature format aged poorly as the specific political moment the show was commenting on receded. Crod Mandoon and the Flaming Sword of Fire. Not animation, but worth a passing mention, as the kind of comedy-fantasy hybrid that networks were commissioning in the early 2000s, under the vague impression that South Park's willingness to be deliberately cheap-looking translated to other formats. It didn't. 6 episodes on Comedy Central and BBC Two. Gone. The pattern across the international wave is consistent with the American one. The shows that tried to copy the surface of the South Park formula, the cheap animation, the crude humor, the topical references, mostly failed. The shows that came to adjacent territory through their own creative logic, like Clone High, tended to find an audience, however small, that genuinely connected with what the show was doing. The formula, as always, is not the surface. The formula is what's underneath the surface, and that's as true in London and Toronto as it is in Los Angeles. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because one of the things South Park inadvertently demonstrated, through its deliberately rough aesthetic, through its paper-cutout origins, through the fact that its first season used software that cost a fraction of what traditional animation pipelines required, was that adult animated comedy didn't have to be expensive to exist. The bar, at least for the visual quality, had been set somewhere within reach of someone with a computer and enough time. And the internet heard that. The early Flash animation era, roughly 2000 through 2008, though the tale extends further on both ends, produced hundreds of web series that were in conversation with South Park in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes just absorbed through the cultural atmosphere. These were animations made by individuals, small teams, sometimes just one person with a Wacom tablet and a copy of Flash, finding audiences through aggregator sites like Newgrounds and Albino Black Sheep, and later through the early iterations of YouTube. Most of them are gone now. The platforms they lived on have closed or changed. The specific file formats they used are no longer playable in standard browsers. The communities that shared them have dispersed. What remains is a collection of memories in the minds of people who were in their teens in the mid-2000s, and a scattered archive of content that enthusiasts have worked to preserve. Let me talk about a few of them. Neurotically Yours, also known as Foamy the Squirrel, was created by Jonathan Ian Mathers and began in October 2003. The format was simple. A neurotic goth girl named Germaine and her squirrel Foamy, who delivered rants about modern life, consumerism, popular culture, and whatever was annoying the creator that week. The rants were the point. Foamy ranted. The audience, and who were largely in the demographic of people who found things in mainstream culture deeply annoying and had nowhere to direct that annoyance, responded. The South Park influence was in the willingness to go after targets without much care for whether the targets would enjoy the experience. South Park taught a generation of online creators that you could make comedy by just saying what you actually thought, at volume without performing the kind of social courtesy that television comedy usually performed. Foamy the Squirrel was doing exactly that, from a home production setup to an audience that found it through peer sharing rather than through any kind of distribution apparatus. The series ran for years. It's still occasionally updated. At its peak, Germaine and Foamy had a genuine following, fan art, fan fiction, merchandise, that existed entirely within the early internet's informal economy of attention and sharing. Mathers eventually restructured the series significantly, changing character designs and tonal approach in response to his own evolution as a creator, which produced some friction with longtime fans. But the core, the neurotic squirrel, the rant format, the willingness to be annoying in the service of honesty, persisted. Ed's World began in 2004 and was created by Ed Gould. The format was a group of 4 friends, Ed, Tom, Matt, and Tord, having adventures in a universe that was warm and anarchic and loosely connected by recurring jokes and recurring character dynamics. The animation style was simple. The humor was affectionate rather than aggressive. The South Park influence was distant. This was more closely related to the British tradition of surreal comedy sketch writing, with animation as the delivery mechanism. What happened to Eddsworld and why it matters in this conversation is specific and genuinely moving. Ed Gould was diagnosed with leukemia in 2006 and died in March 2012 at the age of 23. The series was continued by his friends and collaborators, particularly Tom Ridgewell, who voiced the character of Tom and took on production responsibilities, as a way of honoring the work Gould had created. The continuation, which was called Eddsworld Legacy, ran from 2012 to 2016 and produced new episodes with a team of animators and writers who'd been part of the original community. Subsequent continuations have been produced by others. Eddsworld found a global audience on YouTube in a way that the earlier Flash animation format had never enabled. The warm, anarchic energy of the original was preserved in the continuation. The community around the show, which had grown through the years of Gould's illness and expanded dramatically after his death, remained devoted and active in a way that's unusual for a web animation that never had network backing or professional distribution. I mention Eddsworld here not because it was a South Park imitator, it really wasn't, but because it represents a version of what the web animation era could produce that was distinct from the shock comedy template that South Park had established. The same democratization of animation that allowed Foamy the Squirrel to exist also allowed Eddsworld to exist. The outputs were completely different. Homestar Runner is worth a mention briefly as another early web animation that found a genuine audience without being particularly interested in the South Park mode. Created by brothers Matt and Mike Chapman in 2000, Homestar Runner was a Flash animation universe centered on a group of characters living in a kind of abstract nowhere that parodied old cartoons, video games, internet culture, and itself simultaneously. The show had a dedicated following for years. Updates continue intermittently to this day, and its specific sensibility, affectionate surrealism, gentle absurdism, deeply specific references that rewarded close attention, was entirely its own. The South Park-adjacent web animations tended to cluster around a few recurring modes. The rant video, one character delivering aggressive opinions about something. The shock short, cute or innocent aesthetic with violent or disturbing content. The parody, taking a known property and finding comedy in the gap between the original and the exaggerated version. The slice of life, small-scale character comedy that didn't try for any satirical ambition and just attempted to be charming. The shock shorts borrowed most directly from South Park. Happy Tree Friends was the landmark example, but there were hundreds of smaller productions in that vein, some genuinely creative, most forgettable. The rant videos borrowed the format of South Park's satirical aggression without the satirical content, which meant they tended to become ranting for its own sake fairly quickly. The parodies and slice-of-life animations were doing something different enough that the South Park comparison doesn't really stick. What the web era demonstrated, taken as a whole, is that the democratization of animation production didn't automatically produce more South Parks. What it produced was a very large number of animated videos at varying quality levels, finding audiences at varying scales, in a pre-YouTube environment that had no reliable way to aggregate or measure those audiences. The few web animations that found genuinely significant followings did so through something specific, through a creative identity or a community or a timing that nobody had planned and nobody could have engineered. That's actually the same conclusion you reach when you look at the television shows in this conversation. The ones that worked, Moral Oral's final seasons, Clone High, Super Jail's specific niche, worked because of something specific that couldn't be manufactured by simply copying the elements of a formula someone else had developed. South Park looked like a formula. It wasn't. Or rather, the formula was downstream of something else. And we'll get to that in a moment. This one's a bit different from everything else we've talked about tonight, and I want to be upfront that the documentation on it in English is thinner than I'd like, which is actually part of what makes it interesting. Block 13, known in some markets as Block 13, is an animated series from the Arab world, produced for an Arabic language audience, working within a completely different cultural and regulatory context than anything we've talked about so far, and operating from a South Park-influenced template in ways that the online communities discussing it have found genuinely surprising and genuinely interesting. The show centers on a group of children living in an apartment block, the block of the title, and their various misadventures. The comparison to South Park gets made almost every time the show appears in English-language discussion, and the creators have been somewhat ambiguous in interviews about the extent of the influence, which is a familiar response from people who've made something that clearly rhymes with something else and aren't entirely sure how to discuss that publicly. What makes Block 13 interesting in the context of this conversation isn't whether it's a South Park ripoff. That question is actually less important than it might seem. What's interesting is what the show chose to keep from the template and what it chose to change. It kept the children as protagonists. It kept the small, contained community setting. It kept the comedy coming from the gap between what children are supposed to say and what these children actually say. It kept the satirical observation of adult behavior through the specific lens of children who haven't yet been taught to pretend that they don't see the things they see. What it changed, necessarily given the cultural and regulatory context, is the register. The religious content that South Park treats as a target for satire occupies a very different position in a show made for a primarily Muslim Arabic-speaking audience. The political targets are different. The social dynamics being satirized are specific to a different community's experience. The show isn't making jokes about the same thing South Park makes jokes about. It's making jokes about its own context, through a format it has borrowed from a different context, and the result is something that has found a real audience, both within its primary market and among diaspora viewers who find something in it that resonates with their own experience of navigating between cultures. The TikTok fandom around Block 13, which is active and enthusiastic as of 2026, years after the show's initial run, suggests it's found a genuinely international audience among young Arab viewers and Arab diaspora viewers who grew up watching South Park and recognize the template while also recognizing the specifically Arab references being filtered through it. The comments on Block 13 content frequently run along the lines of, "I can't believe this exists," and "this is what I needed," which is a very specific response that suggests the show is doing something for its audience that other things weren't doing. And here's the fun detail. The show has occasionally been discussed online in the context of whether it actually had permission from South Park's creators to use the format. The short answer is no, you can't get permission to use a format because formats aren't copyrightable. You can make a show about foul-mouthed children in a small community without Trey Parker and Matt Stone's approval. Many people have. The question of whether Block 13 is a ripoff is really a question about how we define that word, and whether similarity of inspiration constitutes theft or just parallel evolution. I lean toward the view that it's parallel evolution with a specific additional input. The South Park template exists as a publicly available creative model. Block 13 used it, filled it with different content, set it in a different context, and aimed it at a different audience. That's not theft. That's how creative culture spreads. The question isn't whether the show borrowed from South Park. The question is whether the borrowing produced something that had its own reason to exist. And based on the fan base it's built, the answer seems to be yes. And that's exactly what most of the American shows in this video failed to do. They borrowed the template without having their own content to fill it with. Block 13, whatever its shortcomings, seems to have found content that was genuinely its own. Jokes and observations and character dynamics that came from the specific cultural context the show was made in. That specificity is what the failed American imitators were missing. There's a structural reality about Comedy Central in the 2000s and 2010s that tends to get lost in individual show discussions but becomes visible when you look at the whole landscape. Comedy Central was, for most of this period, a network with one signature success and everything else. South Park was the signature success. Everything else was varying degrees of elsewhere. That position created a specific kind of pressure on every other show the network developed and aired. The success of South Park set the terms by which Comedy Central evaluated its own programming. South Park had high ratings. South Park had cultural impact. South Park generated controversies that kept the network in the news. South Park attracted an advertiser-friendly demographic, young adult men who were difficult to reach through other programming. Every show that wasn't South Park was being measured against those outcomes, consciously or not. And that measurement was corrosive in a specific way. It created an incentive for shows to try to be South Park adjacent, to be edgy, to be controversial, to target the same demographic with similar content, even when the individual show's creative identity pointed in a different direction. Ugly Americans was a show about social work and immigration bureaucracy that was under pressure to be edgier than its premise naturally called for. It responded by incorporating more adult content than the concept necessarily needed. The result was a show that felt slightly at odds with itself, a social satire that was also trying to be a shock comedy and not fully succeeding at either. Drawn Together was the most extreme version of this pressure because Drawn Together had built its entire identity around the goal of out-South Parking South Park. The show didn't have a creative identity that had been distorted by the competitive context. It had a creative identity that was defined by the competitive context from the beginning, which is why the Drawn Together movie is such a strange document. The show's final statement about itself is fundamentally a statement about its relationship to another show. Outside of Comedy Central, the pressure was different, but the dynamic was similar. Networks that wanted their own adult animated hits were inevitably in conversation with South Park as a reference point. Even shows on Adult Swim, which had its own creative culture, its own identity, its own relationship with the kind of experimental animation that South Park wasn't doing, were aware of South Park as the benchmark for what adult animation could commercially achieve. Shows that were doing something genuinely different, like Super Jail or Moral Oral, were still being discussed in comparison to the benchmark. The comparison usually went, this is doing something interesting, but it's not South Park. As if not being South Park were a limitation rather than a description. The one show that most cleanly escaped this gravitational pull was Bob's Burgers. Not because Bob's Burgers was South Park adjacent, it wasn't at all, but because it built its identity so completely on its own terms, with such specificity and warmth and character-driven consistency, that the South Park comparison simply didn't apply. You couldn't say Bob's Burgers was trying to be South Park because nothing about it suggested the attempt. It was trying to be Bob's Burgers, and it succeeded at that with enough conviction that the comparison never stuck. The shows that found something lasting found it by stepping away from the template entirely, the way Bob's Burgers just quietly became itself without looking over its shoulder. The ones that kept chasing the original never caught it. Let me take a beat here before we move into the closing, because we've been through a lot of shows tonight, some bad, some interesting, some genuinely good in their own limited way. And I think there's a larger observation sitting underneath all of this that's worth making explicitly. The shows in this video failed or were canceled or found only small audiences for various specific reasons. Drawn Together had no point. The Good Family had a too narrow target. Moral Orel was canceled before it could complete what it had started. Ugly Americans couldn't figure out what it was in the time it had. Mr. Pickles exhausted its premise. The international wave was working with borrowed infrastructure in unfamiliar cultural territory. The web era produced lots of things, most of which disappeared. But underneath all of the specific reasons, there's one general reason. Every show in this video copied something visible about South Park. The animation style, the children as protagonists, the willingness to say things other shows wouldn't, the small town or contained community setting, the political incorrectness. These are the observable features of the show. These are the things you can describe to someone who hasn't seen it and have them understand what you're talking about. None of them copied the thing underneath those features. The thing underneath is this. Parker and Stone start with a target, not a format, not a tone, not a level of permissiveness or a visual aesthetic. A target, something that's happening in the world that bothers them or interests them, or that they think deserves to be examined at an angle that mainstream discourse isn't examining it from. An episode begins with the target and then finds the comedy and the character and the plot in service of getting at that target. The format is a delivery mechanism. The irreverence is a delivery mechanism. The foul-mouthed children are a delivery mechanism. What's being delivered is a perspective. An imitator can copy the delivery mechanism. An imitator cannot copy the perspective because the perspective belongs to the people who hold it. Parker and Stone's perspective on American culture is specific to them, to where they grew up, to what they've observed over decades of close attention to how American society works and fails to work, to what they find funny and what they find genuinely maddening and where those two things overlap. Their libertarian-adjacent, equal opportunity satirical position, going after everyone, protecting no one, finding the hypocrisy wherever it lives, rather than wherever it's politically convenient to find it, is not a format choice, it's a worldview. And worldviews can't be licensed or copied. Here's another thing that can't be copied: the 6-day production cycle and everything that cycle implies about the relationship between the show and the present moment. South Park is alive in the world in a way that no other animated comedy manages. It can respond to this week's news. It can make a joke about something that happened last Monday. It can be wrong in public about something and correct course the following episode. That responsiveness creates a relationship with the audience that is fundamentally different from the relationship that a show planned 9 months in advance can have. The audience watches South Park knowing that what they're watching is contemporaneous. The show is happening right now alongside everything else that's happening. That's a genuinely unusual quality in a television program, and it's invisible in the finished product. You don't see the 6-day production cycle, you just feel the aliveness of the result. And here's a third thing, which I find the most interesting of all. South Park is currently in its 28th season. It has produced well over 300 episodes. It has been on the air continuously since 1997. In July 2025, Parker & Stone signed a deal with Paramount Global worth $1.5 billion that guarantees new episodes through at least 2029 or 2030. The show is not going anywhere. Every show in this video is gone. Drawn Together, gone. The Good Family, gone. Moral Oral, gone. Ugly Americans, gone. Super Jail, gone. Mr. Pickles, gone. Chosen, gone. Clone High's original run ended after 1 season. The web animations, most of them inaccessible. The international attempts, canceled and forgotten. The original keeps running. That's not luck. It's also not purely formula, because the formula demonstrably can't be transplanted. I think it's something to do with the particular combination of Parker and Stone's creative instincts and their institutional autonomy. They've had creative control over South Park in a way that few television creators have over anything. They've been able to make what they wanted to make, and what they wanted to make turned out to have a depth that wasn't apparent from the surface. There's a specific episode I keep thinking about in this context. In season 18, South Park changed its format. It moved from episodic, self-contained episodes to a serialized season structure where events in one episode affected subsequent episodes. It was a significant creative risk. The show was essentially changing its DNA at the point when most long-running shows are coasting. The move produced some of the show's most critically acclaimed seasons. In season 19, it deconstructed its own format again, producing a season about political correctness that was simultaneously one of the most topical things the show had ever done, and a meditation on what it meant to be doing satire in a culture that was changing its relationship to that kind of comedy. An imitator can't do that. An imitator can't reinvent itself because an imitator doesn't have a self to reinvent. It has a set of borrowed features that only hold together as long as the borrowing is close enough to the original. The moment you try to evolve the formula, you need the thing underneath the formula. You need the perspective. And if the perspective was borrowed along with everything else, it can't evolve because it was never really yours to begin with. South Park has lasted because Parker and Stone have never stopped having things to say. That sounds obvious. It's not. Most television creators run out of things to say long before their shows stop being produced. The machine keeps going because cancellation is expensive and audiences are habitual, not because anyone has anything new to contribute. South Park, for nearly 3 decades, has managed to keep finding new things to say. New targets, new angles, new ways of approaching the same American culture it's been watching for all that time. And when it occasionally runs out of new things, it says so explicitly in episodes that are essentially about the difficulty of being South Park, and then finds a new way back in. That's the thing nobody managed to copy. Not the crude humor, not the simple animation, not the small town, not the kids, the hunger to say something, and the discipline to figure out what that something actually is before the episode goes to air. There's one more thing I want to add to the analysis before we move to the close, because it's the thing that ties all of this together in a way I haven't quite stated directly yet. South Park has been canceled. Twice, in a sense. The show has had moments, particularly in its middle period, around seasons 7 through 12, when it was not the cultural phenomenon it had been in its first years, and when the critical and popular consensus seemed to be shifting toward the view that the show had peaked and was now coasting. Reviews in that period were less enthusiastic. The cultural conversation around the show was less intense. There were legitimate questions about whether Parker and Stone still had things to say that the format hadn't already exhausted. And then the show reinvented itself. The serialized format of Season 18, the extraordinary cultural commentary of Season 19, which produced episodes about Donald Trump's political rise before most mainstream media outlets had taken that rise seriously. The expansion of Randy Marsh's role from comic relief character to central figure in some of the show's most ambitious episodes. The mythology that deepened around characters like Kenny and Cartman in ways that gave longtime fans things to actually sit with. I don't know of another show in television history that has reinvented itself meaningfully in its 18th season. Most shows that reach Season 18 are either still running on inertia, still being watched out of habit rather than genuine interest, or they've already been canceled. The ones that survive to Season 18 are rarely producing their best work. South Park at Season 18 produced some of its best work. That capacity for reinvention is the final piece of the formula that no imitator could access. You can't copy a show's capacity to change because that capacity depends on the creator's relationship to the material being alive and developing in real time. An imitator that has copied the formula doesn't have a living relationship with that formula. It has a dead copy of someone else's living relationship. Dead copies don't evolve. They just gradually become more obviously dead. Here's a way of thinking about it that I find clarifying. Parker and Stone started making South Park in 1997. As of this recording, they've been making South Park for 28 years. In those 28 years, they've produced over 300 episodes, a feature film, 7 streaming specials, multiple video games, and a Broadway musical. They've also managed to maintain creative control over the project throughout. Their deal with Comedy Central and later Paramount has given them an unusual degree of autonomy. The show has always been, in a meaningful sense, theirs. An imitator working on a network contract doesn't have that ownership. They have a contract for a show they've pitched and sold to a network that owns it, made with a network's money under a network's conditions. The creative autonomy is different, and the relationship to the material is different because the ownership is different. Parker and Stone can take South Park in any direction they choose because it belongs to them. Geeser and Silverstein could not take Drawn Together in any direction Comedy Central wouldn't sanction because it belonged to Comedy Central. The ownership structure of the show is part of the formula. The creative freedom that comes from ownership is part of the formula. The willingness to use that freedom to say things that make the audience uncomfortable and to trust that the audience will come back because they always have. It's part of the formula. None of that can be bottled. None of it can be copied. It can only be built slowly through the particular combination of talent and autonomy and commitment to a project over a very long time. Most of the shows in this video were canceled before they had time to build anything. Some were canceled before their creators had time to figure out what they were building toward. The lucky few, Moral Oral's 3rd season, Clone High's original season, managed to produce something with lasting value in the time they had. They managed it because the creators knew what they were trying to do and moved toward it with conviction, not because they'd found the South Park formula, because they'd found their own. That's the lesson, I think. Not that South Park can't be imitated, but that the attempt to imitate it reveals every time that the real formula, the thing that sustained it across nearly 3 decades, is creative ownership. Knowing what you're trying to say and having the institutional freedom and the personal courage to say it, on a deadline, in public, with your name on it. South Park has that. The imitators mostly didn't. It's getting late. Or maybe it's very late. Or maybe you've been listening to this for a while and the edges of it are starting to blur into the general drift of a night winding down. That's fine. That's what this is for. I've spent a lot of time tonight with shows that didn't survive. And I realized that framing shows that didn't survive, shows that failed, shows that were canceled and forgotten, makes the whole thing sound sadder than it needs to be. Most of these shows were made by people who genuinely believed they had something worth making. Some of them were right. Moral Oral's final season was genuinely worth making. Clone High's original season was genuinely worth making. Happy Tree Friends found an audience of hundreds of millions of people across 16 years, which is not nothing. Eddsworld was a community that sustained itself through grief, which is an extraordinary thing for a small flash animation to be. The ones that failed outright, The Good Family, Chosen, Ugly Americans. Those weren't failures of ambition. They were failures of circumstance, mostly. The wrong network, the wrong slot, the wrong cultural moment, not enough time. Some of the best things that have ever been made on television have failed for those reasons. Some of the worst things have succeeded. The relationship between quality and longevity in television is not reliable. And I think that's worth saying plainly, because it's easy to look at a canceled show and conclude that it was canceled because it was bad. That conclusion isn't always earned. Drawn together is the one case in this conversation where I think the failure was genuinely instructive, where the cancellation does reflect something about the show's creative decisions rather than just bad timing or network indifference. A show that chose to define itself by the rejection of meaning that made that rejection its identity and its argument is a show that was always going to be limited by that choice. You can be funny without meaning something. You can sustain an audience without meaning something. But you probably can't outlast a show that does mean something on the same network when the audience has both options in front of them. The Spirit of Christmas tape that started all of this was passed around Hollywood in 1995 by hand. Literally by hand. VHS cassettes, person to person, at parties and in offices. It found its audience through a chain of individual recommendations in an era before the internet had the infrastructure to distribute video. And then it became a television show, and that television show became one of the most watched basic cable programs in American history. And it kept running for nearly 3 decades, and it attracted imitators from every country with an animation budget, and most of those imitators are gone. 4 kids at a bus stop, snow on the ground. There's something almost immovable about that image. The show has changed significantly over 28 seasons. Characters have been added and developed. Kenny's mythology turned out to be genuinely sad. Randy Marsh became arguably the show's most important character. The format shifted to serialized storytelling and then shifted again. The show evolved in real time alongside the culture it was watching. And yet every episode still starts from something like that image. A small town, some children, the world being the world outside the window of a modest house in Colorado. The imitators were looking at the image. South Park was the thing that had produced the image, and the thing that produced it, the specific creative energy, the specific irreverence, the specific willingness to say what it actually thought, isn't transferable. It just is what it is. That's probably the most honest ending I can put on all of this. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. You can catch the rest of it another time or not. Either's all right. Go easy. Sleep well. See you next time.